The champagne flute in my hand was warm, the lipstick smear on its rim a shade of crimson that didn't match Karen's usual color. She was across the garden, laughing. That sharp, crystalline laugh that used to make my chest tighten with pride but now just made my jaw clench. Her steel sculpture loomed behind her, all jagged edges and knife-like shadows that seemed to cut through the humid summer air. I adjusted my tie, the pocket watch from our 20th anniversary weighing heavily in my breast pocket, ticking faintly like a reminder of time slipping away. Karen's new artistic collaborator, a guy named Jared with the kind of beard that screamed, "I'm trying too hard," was standing just a little too close. His hand grazed her elbow as he leaned in to whisper something, and her laugh shifted, softened. A sound I hadn't heard directed at me in years. The clinking of metal from her sculpture's wind chimes grated against my nerves, each note a tiny hammer against my skull. The wine in my glass tasted sour, the aftertaste of it clinging to my tongue like regret. She'd insisted I fund this damn summer festival, using every connection I had at the museum to make it happen. "It's for my art, Daniel," she'd said, her voice dripping with that faux innocence she'd perfected over the years. "You want me to succeed, don't you?" Of course I did. Or at least I thought I did. But now, watching her tilt her head back to laugh at something Jared said, her hair catching the golden hour light like a halo, I wasn't so sure. The oppressive heat pressed down on me, the kind of sticky warmth that made your shirt cling to your back and your thoughts turn murky. Jared's hand was on her shoulder now, and she wasn't pulling away. He leaned in again, his lips brushing her ear, and I caught the words, barely audible but unmistakable. "Our masterpiece needs more private polishing." Karen's smile didn't falter. If anything, it widened, her eyes flicking to me for just a second. A challenge, a dare. I drained the rest of the champagne, the acidic bite of it burning my throat. The pocket watch ticked louder in my pocket, a metronome keeping time with the sharp edges of her sculpture. The clinking wind chimes, the too close laughter. I thought about our 20th anniversary, about the way she'd smiled at me over candlelight and promised me forever. Now, forever felt like a cruel joke, something brittle and sharp, just like the art she'd surrounded herself with. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the garden, but the heat didn't let up. Karen's laughter rang out again, and I realized, with a sinking feeling, that I was the only one sweating. The hum of the museum's security monitors filled the room, their screens flickering between grainy black and white feeds of empty hallways and the occasional flash of a night guard's flashlight. Daniel sat slumped in his office chair, the glow of the monitors casting jagged shadows across his face. The air smelled faintly of dust and old paper, but beneath it lingered the ghost of Karen's jasmine perfume, a scent that clung to the burner phone Ethan had shoved into his hands hours earlier. The phone itself felt like a live wire in his palm, its screen cracked but still functional. Ethan's voice still echoed in his ears, trembling and raw. "She made me lie about her business trips since 6th grade. The words had hit Daniel like a sledgehammer, but it was the look on his son's face that had shattered him. A mix of guilt and relief, as if he'd been carrying a bomb for years and finally let it go. Daniel scrolled through the messages, his fingers shaking. The texts were a sickening mosaic of Karen's double life. There were flirtatious exchanges with 3 different men, all wealthy patrons of her art, all framed as career investments. One called her his muse, another referred to their private studio sessions, and the third, a gallery owner, had sent her a photo of a hotel bed with the caption, "Your canvas awaits." Each message was a knife twist, but what made it worse was the calculated way Karen had woven her lies into their family life. She'd used Ethan as a shield, teaching him to parrot excuses about late-night meetings and last-minute gallery showings. The baseball trophy on Daniel's desk caught his eye, Ethan's first and only win from Little League. Karen had missed the game, claiming she had a critical client meeting. Now, the trophy felt like a relic from a different life, its golden figure frozen mid-swing, forever oblivious to the cracks spreading beneath their feet. The security monitors flickered again, and for a moment, one of the screens displayed a feed of the museum's family exhibit. A photo of Karen, Ethan, and Daniel from a decade ago smiled back at him, frozen in time. They were standing in front of a Civil War cannon, Karen's arms slung around Daniel's shoulders, her laugh bright and effortless. The contrast between that moment and the cold, pixelated betrayal on the burner phone was almost too much to bear. Daniel's jaw tightened as he read a particularly damning exchange. Karen had written, "Daniel's too buried in his dusty relics to notice anything. Keep the champagne chilled." The casual cruelty of it stung, but what hurt more was the realization that she'd been right. He had been buried in his work, cataloging history while his present crumbled around him. The smell of jasmine grew stronger as he scrolled, the phone's screen reflecting in his glasses. It was as if Karen's presence haunted the device, a lingering reminder of how thoroughly she'd played him. He thought of all the times he'd defended her absences, all the times he'd told Ethan, "Your mom's just passionate about her art." Now those words tasted like ash. The monitors flickered once more, and the family exhibit feed disappeared, replaced by a live view of the museum's grand hall. The empty space felt like a metaphor for his life, once filled with noise and color, now hollow and silent. Daniel leaned back in his chair, the phone still clutched in his hand, and stared at the ceiling. The truth was out, but it didn't bring relief. It just left him wondering how many more lies were waiting to surface. The kitchen smelled like burnt garlic and regret. Our anniversary dinner, what was left of it, sat in a blackened skillet on the stove. Karen had insisted on cooking, something she hadn't done in years, but halfway through, her phone buzzed, and she disappeared into her studio. I found her there later, welding torch in hand, sparks flying as she worked on some jagged, angular monstrosity. The necklace, a gaudy, glittering thing, caught the light as she moved, and I recognized it instantly. The same one I'd seen in gallery partner number 2's Instagram post last week. "You're just jealous I outgrew your dusty history obsession," she sneered, not even looking up. Her voice was sharp, like the edges of her sculptures. She adjusted the necklace with a practiced flick of her wrist, as if daring me to say something. I held up the donor list I'd found in her studio, the one with signatures that didn't match anything in the museum's records. "Jealous? Karen, you've been stealing from the museum. Fundraiser money, donations, it's all been funneled into your account. Do you even care what this could do to us? To Ethan?" She finally turned to face me, her welding mask pushed up, revealing a smirk that made my stomach churn. "Oh, Daniel, you're so predictable. Always worrying about reputation, about history, about rules. Newsflash. Rules are for people who can't afford to break them." She set the torch down on the workbench, the flame still flickering dangerously close to a stack of sketches. "And let's be honest, you're as replaceable as last year's exhibit. A placeholder until something more modern comes along." The words hit like a hammer, each one denting what little was left of the life we'd built. I glanced at the charred remains of our anniversary dinner, still sitting in the kitchen. Even that felt like a metaphor now, something that could have been beautiful, ruined by neglect and arrogance. "You think this is about jealousy?" I said, my voice low. "This is about trust. About us. Or what's left of it." She laughed, a cold, metallic sound that echoed in the studio. "Trust? Oh, Daniel, trust is just another word for control. And I'm done being controlled." She picked up the torch again, igniting it with a hiss. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a commission to finish. Unlike you, some of us are actually moving forward." I stood there for a moment, watching her work, the sparks flying like tiny, angry stars. The donor list crumpled in my hand, the forged signatures suddenly feeling heavier than lead. I thought about Ethan, about the life we tried to build, about the museum and the history I dedicated my life to preserving. And I realized, standing there in the shadow of Karen's latest creation, that some things couldn't be salvaged, no matter how much you wanted to believe otherwise. As I turned to leave, I noticed the welding torch, still unattended, its flame licking dangerously close to the edge of her workbench. For a brief, irrational moment, I thought about leaving it there, letting the fire do what I couldn't. But then I remembered the smell of burnt garlic, the charred remains of what was supposed to be a celebration, and I reached over to turn it off. Some ruins, after all, weren't worth rebuilding. The workshop light buzzed faintly, casting a pale glow over the Civil War sabers laid out on Daniel's workbench. It was 3 a.m., and the house was silent except for the occasional creak of settling wood. He dipped a soft cloth into the polishing compound, the sharp scent of metal cleaner cutting through the stale air. The blade in his hands was tarnished, its surface clouded with decades of neglect. As he rubbed, his own reflection began to emerge, distorted, warped, like the man he'd become over the past few months. Karen had always hated this room, called it his dusty little shrine to dead things. She preferred her studio, with its gleaming steel sculptures and the acrid tang of welding torches. He'd never minded the contrast, her modern chaos against his quiet preservation. But now, as he worked the cloth over the saber's edge, he couldn't stop thinking about how she'd turned their home into a battlefield. The alarm system had been her idea. For safety, she'd said, after that break-in at the museum. But last month, she'd disabled it. It's stifling, she'd complained, waving her hand like she was swatting away a fly. We need better airflow for the parties. Better airflow. He snorted, the sound harsh in the quiet room. Better airflow for her artistic collaborations. More like. He set the saber down and reached for the box tucked under the workbench. Ethan's childhood drawings spilled out, crude sketches of dinosaurs and knights, made during one of the museum's workshops. His son had been so proud of them, presenting each one like a masterpiece. Daniel traced the faded crayon lines, his chest tightening. Karen had rolled her eyes back then. He'll grow out of it, she'd said. But Ethan hadn't. He'd just learned to hide his passions, like he'd hidden the burner phone. The memory of that night clawed at him. Ethan's voice, low and shaking, as he handed over the phone. She made me lie, he'd said, since 6th grade. Daniel's hands clenched around the drawing, crumpling the paper. He smoothed it out carefully, as if he could fix the damage with the same meticulous care he used on the museum's artifacts. But some things couldn't be restored. The bank statement had arrived that afternoon. He'd almost missed it, buried under a stack of gallery invitations. At first, he thought it was a mistake. A second mortgage on the house? He'd stared at the numbers, his stomach churning. The loan had been taken out 6 months ago, right around the time Karen had started hosting those late-night creative sessions in her studio. The signature on the document was his, or a convincing enough forgery to fool the bank. He'd spent hours comparing it to his real signature, the one he'd used on countless museum documents. The differences were subtle, almost imperceptible. But they were there. Karen had always been meticulous, her hands steady as she welded steel or signed contracts. She'd weaponized that precision, turning their home into collateral for her lover's gallery. Daniel picked up another saber, its blade dull and pitted. He worked the cloth over it, the repetitive motion grounding him. This was what he knew how to restore, to preserve. But Karen had left him with nothing to restore. Just ruins, like the artifacts he sometimes found in the museum storage, too damaged to display. The workshop door creaked, and he turned to see Ethan standing in the doorway, his face pale in the dim light. "Dad." His voice was quiet, hesitant. "You okay?" Daniel set the saber down, forcing a smile. "Yeah, just cleaning up." Ethan hesitated, then stepped inside, his gaze falling on the box of drawings. "I forgot about those. You were a pretty good artist," Daniel said, his voice rough. Ethan shrugged, picking up one of the sketches. "Mom always said they were childish." Daniel's jaw tightened. She was wrong. For a moment, they stood in silence, the weight of everything unsaid pressing down on them. Then Ethan set the drawing back in the box. "We'll figure it out, Dad. Whatever she's done. We'll fix it." Daniel nodded, though the words felt hollow. Fix it. Like the sabers on his workbench, some things could be polished, restored, but others were beyond repair. He glanced at the alarm panel by the door, its red light dark. Karen had disabled it, leaving them exposed. But maybe that was the point. Maybe she wanted him to see, to know how thoroughly she dismantled their life. He picked up the polishing cloth again, the motion steady, deliberate. If she wanted a war, he'd give her one. But not with sabers or words. With patience, precision. The way he'd catalogued every artifact in the museum, every detail preserved for posterity. Karen had forgotten one thing: history wasn't just about the past. It was a weapon, too, and he knew how to wield it. The air in the museum's conservation lab was dry and brittle, the kind of stillness that made every breath feel like a disturbance. Daniel sat at his workbench, the faint hum of the overhead lights the only sound. His hands, clad in white cotton gloves from the 1800s, threadbare but still serviceable, moved with practiced precision. The gloves were a relic, much like the artifacts he spent his life preserving. But tonight, they weren't protecting history. They were dismantling it. Karen's sculpting blueprints lay sprawled across the table, her angular, aggressive designs staring back at him like accusations. He'd found them tucked behind a stack of old financial statements in her studio, a place she told him was off-limits for months. The blueprints were covered in notes not about art but about money. Hidden in the margins were scribbled figures, dates, and names. Gallery partner number 2, $25,000 installments. Studio rental paid in full by sponsor C. The numbers were as sharp and cutting as her sculptures. He reached for the hollowed-out art history tome on the shelf, its spine cracked and weathered. Inside, nestled in the carved-out pages, was a decoy USB drive. It looked innocuous, just another piece of museum memorabilia. But it held everything: bank statements, wire transfers, emails. Karen had been meticulous, but not meticulous enough. She'd forgotten that her husband spent his days studying the minutiae of history, the way a signature curved or a letter slanted. He could spot a fake from a mile away. The notary had stared at him earlier that day, her pen hovering over the document as Daniel slid a sheet of paper across the table. It was a perfect replica of Karen's signature, every loop and flourish identical. "I catalog handwriting for a living," he'd said, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. The notary had nodded, her professionalism masking her unease, and stamped the document without question. Now, back in the lab, Daniel pulled up the files on his computer. Each one was a piece of the puzzle, a fragment of the life Karen had built on lies. He'd spent weeks compiling them, cross-referencing dates and amounts, tracing the money flow like an archaeologist unearthing a lost civilization. The evidence was irrefutable, but it wasn't enough to just have it. He needed to use it. Karen's voice echoed in his head, sharp and dismissive. "You're just jealous I outgrew your dusty history obsession." She'd said it during their last argument, her eyes glinting with that cold, metallic edge she reserved for her art. And, he now realized, for him. He'd stood there, dumbfounded, as she adjusted the $5,000 necklace she'd claimed was a gift from a grateful patron. The necklace was just another piece of the facade, another layer of the lie. His fingers hovered over the keyboard. He'd been playing the supportive husband, nodding along as Karen rambled about her latest career breakthrough. He'd even helped her secure a loan for a new studio space, using his museum contacts to vouch for her. She'd been so focused on her next big project that she hadn't noticed him slipping into her digital world, copying files and creating backups. She thought he was oblivious, too wrapped up in his old documents and artifacts to see what was right in front of him. But Daniel wasn't oblivious. He was patient, and patience, he'd learned, was the most powerful tool in his arsenal. He clicked open a folder labeled Exhibits and began organizing the files. Each one was a piece of the story, a chapter in the narrative Karen had been crafting for years. Only now, the story wasn't hers to control. It was his. The gloves felt heavy on his hands as he reached for the blueprints again. He traced the lines of her designs, the sharp angles and cold, unyielding shapes. They were a reflection of her, he realized, hard, calculated, and unfeeling. But even the strongest metal could be melted down, reshaped. And Daniel knew exactly how to apply the heat. He slipped the USB drive back into the hollowed-out book and placed it on the shelf. It looked like just another artifact, another piece of the museum's collection. But it was a bomb, ticking quietly in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to explode. Karen's laughter echoed in his memory, that bright, artificial sound she used at gallery openings and fundraisers. She thought she was untouchable, that her art and her charm would protect her. But Daniel had spent his life studying the past, and he knew one thing for certain. Every empire falls eventually, and he was ready to watch hers crumble. The gallery was a tomb of pretension, all polished concrete and sharp angles, the kind of place where even the air felt expensive. Karen's sculptures loomed like jagged sentinels, their steel surfaces catching the flicker of overhead spotlights. She stood at the center of it all, her laughter cutting through the murmur of the crowd, that same laugh that used to make me feel like I was part of something rare. Now it just sounded hollow, like the clink of a glass against a counter in an empty room. I lingered near the back, nursing a glass of champagne that tasted like vinegar. Ethan was somewhere in the crowd, the museum camera I'd lent him hanging around his neck like a tourist prop. He'd insisted on coming, said he wanted to see it for himself. I didn't have the heart to tell him no. The first sign something was wrong came when the champagne flutes stopped clinking. A ripple went through the room, a collective inhale as the doors swung open. 3 men in dark suits stepped inside, their faces as unyielding as the sculptures around them. Karen's smile faltered, just for a second, before she smoothed it over and glided toward them, her heels clicking like a metronome. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" she asked, her voice dripping with that practiced charm. One of the agents held up a badge, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "Aris, we're here to seize these works as part of an ongoing investigation." The room erupted in whispers. Karen's face went pale, her hand flying to the necklace at her throat. The one I knew came from gallery partner number 2. She started to protest, but the words died in her throat as another agent began taking photos of her sculptures, the flash bouncing off the steel like lightning. That's when the first pedestal gave way. It wasn't dramatic, not at first, just a slow, creaking tilt as the weight became too much. Then it crashed to the floor, shattering into pieces and sending Karen's prized sculpture skidding across the concrete. The sound was deafening, a cacophony of metal on stone that seemed to hang in the air. Karen screamed, a raw, guttural sound that didn't fit the polished image she'd spent years crafting. She lunged for the agent, but he stepped aside, his expression impassive. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to step back," he said, his tone as cold as the sculptures he was cataloging. I didn't move, couldn't. The scene felt like it was unfolding in slow motion, every detail etched into my mind. The way the champagne spray from a dropped glass froze midair, catching the light like tiny diamonds. The faint smell of jasmine perfume mingling with the sharp tang of spilled wine. The sound of Ethan's camera shutter clicking softly, capturing it all. Karen turned to me then, her eyes wild, her mascara smudged. "Daniel," she hissed, her voice trembling with a mix of rage and desperation. "What did you do?" I didn't answer. There was no point. The truth was already there, written in the way her patrons were backing away, their faces pale, their phones buzzing with notifications. I'd made sure of that. Every forged signature, every siphoned dollar, every incriminating text. It had all been sent to the right people, packaged neatly with a bow. The agents began dismantling her sculptures, their tools screeching against the metal. Karen's masterpiece, the one she'd claimed was her magnum opus, was loaded onto a dolly like it was nothing more than scrap. She sank to her knees, her hands clutching at the hem of her dress, as the crowd began to thin, dispersing like smoke. Ethan appeared at my side, his face pale but determined. "Dad," he said softly, handing me the camera. Did you know it would be like this?" I looked at him, at the boy who'd been forced to grow up too fast because of her lies. "Not exactly," I admitted. "But she made her choices, Ethan. We're just living with the consequences." He nodded, his jaw tightening as he watched his mother crumple on the floor, her dreams reduced to rubble around her. The last of the sculptures was wheeled out, leaving behind an empty pedestal and a silence so heavy it felt like it could crush us. Karen's laughter, once so full of life, was gone, replaced by the hollow echo of her sobs. And as I turned to leave, the taste of that bitter champagne still lingering on my tongue, I realized something. Some ruins aren't meant to be rebuilt. The foreclosure notice trembled in Karen's hand, her once manicured nails now chipped and raw from weeks of frantic sculpting. She stood in the middle of her studio, surrounded by half-finished metal monstrosities that seemed to lean toward her like judgmental sentinels. Her laughter was brittle, echoing off the steel beams. "Your precious legacy?" she spat, her voice cracking like a porcelain vase dropped on concrete. "You think this is what I wanted? To be reduced to some cautionary tale in your dusty little museum?" I didn't answer. Instead, I adjusted the display case in front of me, the glass cool against my fingertips. Inside rested her wedding ring, twisted and blackened. The gold melted into a shapeless lump. It had been found in the crucible of her studio, tossed aside like scrap metal. Next to it, a small plaque read, "Symbols of promises broken." The irony wasn't lost on me. Karen had always preferred her art to speak for her, and now so would I. The museum's new exhibit, Scandalous Local History, had opened to record crowds. Families shuffled past, their murmurs a low hum beneath the sterile museum lights. Children pointed and giggled at the interactive display where a red button, when pressed, played voicemails Karen had left for her gallery partners. Her voice, once smooth and commanding, now sounded desperate, pleading. "We need to talk." One message began, her tone clipped. "The money's gone, and if you don't—" The recording cut off abruptly, leaving the gallery in stunned silence. Karen's face flushed crimson as she stormed toward the display, her heels clicking sharply against the marble floor. "You had no right," she hissed, her breath hot and sour with anger. "These are private. I'm private. You can't just air my life out like some cheap reality show." I stepped between her and the exhibit, my hands raised in a gesture of calm I didn't feel. "You made it public the moment you forged my signature on those loans," I said, my voice steady despite the knot in my chest. "You turned our life into a performance, Karen. This is just the encore." Her eyes darted to the next display, where her love letters were encased in glass, their florid prose illuminated by soft, accusing light. One letter, penned to her third patron, was particularly damning. "Daniel is so wrapped up in his dusty relics, he doesn't even notice the masterpiece I'm creating." The crowd murmured, their whispers weaving a tapestry of judgment. A group of schoolchildren, far too young to understand the nuances of betrayal, giggled at the caricature sketch of Karen labeled, "Mean Lady Art." One boy pointed and said, "She looks like a witch." His teacher shushed him, but the damage was done. Karen's shoulders slumped, her defiance faltering as the weight of her choices pressed down on her. She reached out, her fingers brushing the glass case that held her ring, and for a moment, I thought I saw regret flicker in her eyes. But then she straightened, her chin jutting out in that familiar, stubborn way. "You think this makes you noble?" she sneered. "Preserving my failures like they're some kind of historical artifact? You're just as petty as I am, Daniel. The only difference is you're better at hiding it." I didn't argue. There was no point. Instead, I gestured to the final display, a timeline of her rise and fall, complete with photos, documents, and even a few of her sculptures, now labeled Artifice over Art. The centerpiece was a blown-up image of her studio, its walls lined with blueprints and financial notes scribbled in her elegant hand. The caption beneath it read, "Every masterpiece has a price." Karen stared at it for a long moment, her chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. Then, without a word, she turned and walked away, her heels clicking a staccato rhythm that faded into the distance. I watched her go, the weight of the past 2 decades pressing down on me like a stone. But as I turned back to the exhibit, I caught sight of Ethan in the crowd, his face lit with pride as he explained the history of a Depression-era quilt to a group of wide-eyed kids. And for the first time in months, I felt something other than anger. I felt hope. The artifacts had spoken, and they'd told the truth. The rebuilt children's wings smelled like fresh paint and sawdust, a sharp contrast to the sterile, metallic tang that always clung to Karen's studio. Ethan stood in the doorway, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his hoodie, looking more like his mother every day. Same sharp jawline, same defiant tilt of the chin. But when he spoke, it was all Daniel. Quiet, thoughtful. "She never smiled," Ethan said, his voice cracking like it used to when he was a kid and didn't want to cry. "Not like you do here." Daniel glanced at the wall where a group of third graders were pinning their "What History Taught Me" notes to a corkboard. One of them had written, "History is like a time machine, but you don't need batteries." He smiled, but it felt heavy, like dragging a stone up a hill. The divorce settlement had come through that morning. Karen's assets, her studio, her ill-gotten sculptures, even the damn necklace were gone, liquidated to fund the museum's new education programs. Daniel had expected to feel something. Vindication, maybe. Relief. Instead, he just felt tired. Ethan wandered over to the polished saber display, now labeled Guardians of Truth. He traced the glass case with one finger, his reflection warped by the curve. "You ever think about getting rid of this stuff?" he asked. "It's kind of dark." Daniel shook his head. "History's not always pretty, but it's important. Even the ugly parts." Ethan nodded, but his eyes drifted to the empty pedestal in the corner, tagged Temporary Installation. It was where Karen's last sculpture had stood, the one she'd called Eternal Flame. It had been a twisted mess of steel and glass, jagged edges catching the light like broken promises. Daniel had wanted to melt it down, but Ethan had asked him to leave the pedestal empty. "Let people wonder," he'd said. "It's better than giving her the satisfaction of being remembered." The kids were giggling now, crowding around the time capsule they'd helped fill earlier. Daniel watched as they dropped in their notes, their laughter bouncing off the high ceilings. One of the boys, no older than 7, looked up at him with wide eyes. "Are you going to open this when we're old?" he asked. Daniel crouched down to his level. "Maybe, or maybe someone else will. That's the thing about history, it's not just ours. It belongs to everyone who comes after." The boy nodded solemnly, like he'd just been handed the keys to the universe. Daniel stood, his knees creaking, and caught Ethan's eye. His son was smiling, just a little, and for the first time in months, it didn't feel like the world was ending. They walked out together, past the saber display and the empty pedestal, into the sunlight streaming through the museum's new windows. Ethan slung an arm around Daniel's shoulders, his grip firm and steady. "You did good, Dad," he said. Daniel didn't answer. He didn't need to. The museum hummed around them, alive with the sound of children's voices and the soft creak of history settling into place. It wasn't revenge. It wasn't even justice. It was something quieter, something that might just outlast them both. The digital frame on Daniel's desk cycled through visitor thank you letters, each one glowing faintly in the dim light of his office. One note caught his eye. "Mr. Daniels, your exhibit made me realize history isn't just about the past. It's about who we choose to be." He leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking softly, and let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. The office smelled faintly of lemon polish and old paper, a scent that had become as familiar as the weight of his grandfather's pocket watch in his hand. Karen's final text flickered on his phone screen, unread for the 3rd time that hour. He'd archived it, but the words still burned in his mind. "You've become what you curate, cold, dead things." Her voice, sharp and venomous, seemed to echo in the silence. He could almost see her standing there, her angular steel sculptures casting knife-like shadows across the room. Her lips curled in that familiar sneer. But the room was empty now, save for the ticking of the pocket watch and the faint hum of the museum's HVAC system. He stood abruptly, shoving the phone into his pocket, and walked out into the gallery halls. The fraudulent glamour exhibit was still drawing crowds, its centerpiece, Karen's confiscated necklace, gleaming under carefully calibrated lights. Visitors paused, their faces a mix of fascination and disgust as they read the placard detailing its provenance. Daniel lingered near the back, watching as a young couple exchanged hushed whispers. "Imagine wearing something like that," the woman murmured, her voice tinged with disbelief. "It's like carrying a lie around your neck." The pocket watch ticked louder in his hand, its rhythm steady and unyielding. He turned it over, his thumb brushing the engraving on the back. "To Daniel, my guardian of time. A gift from Ethan on their last Father's Day together before the divorce." His son had been quiet lately, spending more time in the museum's workshop, teaching kids how to weld safely using the protocols Daniel had implemented. It was strange, seeing Ethan so focused, so determined. He'd inherited Karen's artistic drive, but none of her cruelty. Daniel's phone buzzed again, pulling him from his thoughts. It was a message from the museum board, congratulating him on his official election as director. The title felt heavy, like a medal he hadn't earned but couldn't refuse. He scrolled through the attached press release, his eyes lingering on the line about record attendance. The Truth Through Time initiative was working. People were coming, not just to gawk at scandal, but to learn, to remember. He slipped the phone back into his pocket and walked to the exhibit's interactive display, where a button allowed visitors to listen to Karen's voicemails. He pressed it, her voice crackling through the speakers. "Daniel, you're making a mistake. You think you've won, but you've just locked yourself in your little glass case. You're as lifeless as your relics." A group of teenagers nearby giggled, one of them mimicking her tone with exaggerated disdain. "Cold, dead things," the boy said, and the others laughed. Daniel didn't flinch. He'd heard it all before. Instead, he walked to the window overlooking the museum's new children's wing, where Ethan was demonstrating how to restore an old quilt. The patchwork fabric told a story of betrayal and resilience, its stitches holding together fragments of a life that had been torn apart. Ethan looked up and caught his father's eye, offering a small, tired smile. Karen's words echoed again, but this time, they felt hollow. Cold, dead things? Maybe. But the museum was alive, with laughter, with curiosity, with the steady hum of people learning from the past. And as Daniel watched his son guide a child's hands over the quilt, he realized that was all that mattered. The pocket watch ticked on, its sound no longer a reminder of what he'd lost, but of what he'd built. Karen's voice faded, drowned out by the living, breathing pulse of the museum around him. He turned away from the window, the weight of her words dissolving like smoke in the wind. The thank you letters still glowed on his desk, the necklace still gleamed in its case, and the watch still ticked in his hand. Cold, dead things? No, just proof that even the sharpest blades of betrayal could be forged into something worth preserving. The museum's grand reopening gala buzzed with an energy that felt both familiar and foreign. The air smelled faintly of fresh paint and the earthy tang of locally brewed root beer, a deliberate replacement for the cloying champagne Karen had always insisted on. Daniel stood in the shadow of the restored Depression-era quilt, his fingers absently adjusting his grandfather's tie pin. The brass felt warm against his skin, a grounding weight that reminded him of simpler times. The quilt itself was a masterpiece of resilience. Students from the museum's restoration program had worked tirelessly to patch the frayed edges, weaving new threads over the original fabric that bore faint stains of betrayal and heartache. It was a fitting metaphor, Daniel thought, for what he'd been through. Some scars were meant to be visible, not erased. Ethan was across the room, demonstrating welding techniques to a group of wide-eyed kids. His voice carried a confidence that hadn't been there before, a quiet strength forged in the crucible of their shared ordeal. Daniel watched as his son adjusted the safety goggles, the same ones Karen had once mocked as overkill during her brief foray into metalwork. The irony wasn't lost on him. A reporter from the local paper approached, her notebook poised and her smile a little too eager. "Mr. Carter, do you have any comments about your ex-wife's recent difficulties?" Daniel smiled thinly, his gaze drifting back to the quilt. "Some ruins aren't meant to be rebuilt," he said, his voice steady. "I'd rather focus on what we're creating here." He gestured to the students, their hands busy with needles and thread, piecing together history one stitch at a time. The reporter hesitated, clearly hoping for something juicier, but Daniel had nothing more to give. Karen's downfall was public knowledge now, her name etched into the museum's new, scandalous local history exhibit alongside love letters and forged documents. The artifacts spoke for themselves. He didn't need to add his voice to the cacophony. As the crowd shifted, Daniel caught a glimpse of the empty pedestal in the corner, still tagged as a temporary installation. It had once held one of Karen's angular sculptures, a piece she'd claimed was her magnum opus. Now it stood as a silent reminder of what had been lost and what had been gained. Ethan joined him, wiping his hands on a rag. "You okay, Dad?" Daniel nodded, his throat tightening. "Better than okay. Seeing you teach those kids. It's everything I ever wanted for this place." Ethan grinned, the kind of smile that could light up a room. "Thanks, but I think we both know who really saved this museum." Daniel glanced at the quilt, at the patches that covered the old wounds. "We did," he said simply. "Together." As the evening wound down, Daniel found himself standing in front of the fraudulent glamour case, where Karen's confiscated necklace gleamed under the soft museum lights. It looked almost comical now, a gaudy relic of a life she'd built on lies. He thought of her final text, the one he'd archived without responding. "You've become what you curate, cold, dead things." But he wasn't cold, and the things he curated weren't dead. They were alive with the stories of those who had come before, their struggles and triumphs preserved for future generations. That was his legacy, not revenge. As he turned to leave, the faint ticking of his pocket watch echoed through the silent gallery halls. It was a sound he'd once found comforting, a reminder of time's steady march. Now it felt like a promise that no matter how broken things seemed, there was always a way to stitch them back together. And with that, Daniel Carter walked out of the museum, leaving the ruins of his past behind.